On the 5th of September 1991, Freddie Mercury turned 45 years old. 80 days later, he was dead. The birthday took place at Garden Lodge, the house in Kensington that had been his home for more than a decade, behind the high brick wall that separated his private world from the public one. The gathering was small, deliberately small, in keeping with what Freddie could manage and what he wanted. Peter Freestone was there. Jim Hutton was there. A small number of people who had been the closest constant presences in the final period of his life were there. And what happened in that house on that September afternoon has been described in fragments, carefully, by the people who were present, described with a quality of restraint that suggests they understood, in the moment of living it, that they were inside something that would not easily translate into language. Peter Freestone spent 30 years approaching the edges of that day in interviews and in his memoir, and then stepping back from the full weight of it. This is the story of what he remembered and chose, across those 30 years, to protect. Peter Freestone entered Freddie Mercury's life in 1979 as a dresser at the Royal Opera House, where Freddie occasionally attended performances with an attention and a knowledge that the people around him sometimes found surprising in a rock musician. The connection that formed between them, professional at first, then something much more personal, developed into one of the most sustained and most specific relationships of Freddie's later life. By the early 1980s, Freestone had become his personal assistant in the fullest sense. The person who managed the practical reality of his daily existence, who knew his preferences and his rhythms and his specific requirements with the intimacy of someone who had spent years paying close attention. He was not a friend in the conventional sense. The power differential and the professional context of their relationship were always present, but he was something that the word assistant does not quite capture. He was the person who knew what Freddie Mercury's ordinary days actually looked like. And in the final years, as those days became more difficult and more contained, Freestone became one of the small number of people whose presence Freddie actively relied upon. By the summer of 1991, Freddie Mercury's physical condition had deteriorated to the point where the ordinary parameters of daily life had been significantly reorganized around what his body could manage. He was largely confined to Garden Lodge. He was in pain in ways that he did not discuss directly, that the people around him learned to read through indirect evidence the specific quality of his movements, the duration of his rest periods, the economy with which he now deployed the energy that had once seemed inexhaustible. The illness that had been present since 1987 had entered a phase in which the gap between what he could do and what he had once done was impossible to ignore, even by the people whose instinct was to help him maintain the pretense that things were manageable. Summer of 1991 was not a good period. It was a period of diminishing returns, of good hours within difficult days, of a man who understood with complete clarity what was happening and who had made his peace with it in ways that the people around him were still in the process of making their own peace. The decision to mark his 45th birthday with a gathering was Freddie's own. This is an important detail. Nobody organized a birthday celebration for him as an act of care that he passively received. He wanted it. He asked for it. In the specific way of someone who has thought carefully about what they want to do with the time that remains and has decided that this, the ordinary domestic ritual of a birthday, the people he loved in the same room, food and wine, and the specific quality of an occasion that marks the passage of time was worth the effort it would cost. Peter Freestone has described the planning of that day as something they approached together, him and Freddie, with a practicality that was itself a form of intimacy. What food, what wine, who would be invited, what the shape of the afternoon would be. The choices were Freddie's. Freestone implemented them. And what emerged from that planning was a day that was, in its outward form, as close to an ordinary birthday celebration as the circumstances allowed. The morning of the 5th of September 1991 at Garden Lodge had a specific quality that the people who were present have described in terms that converge on the same thing: deliberate normalcy. There were preparations. The kitchen was active. Flowers had been arranged. The table in the dining room was set with the care that Freddie had always brought to the domestic rituals he valued. And Freddie Mercury himself on that morning moved through the house with a quality of intention that the people around him recognized as his specific way of committing to something, the same quality he had brought to a concert rehearsal or a recording session, translated into the domestic scale of a birthday morning. He was not performing wellness he did not have. He was doing something more specific and more deliberate than performance. He was choosing to be present for the day, fully and without reservation, for as long as the day lasted. The people who gathered at Garden Lodge on the 5th of September, 1991, were the people who had been closest to Freddie in the final years, the specific small circle whose lives had organized themselves around his care and his company across the period of his illness. Jim Hutton, who had shared his home and his daily life for 7 years, was there. Peter Freestone, who had been the practical manager of his existence for more than a decade, was there. A small number of others, friends of the final period, people whose specific relationships with Freddie had deepened, rather than diminished as his world contracted, completed the gathering. The band members were not present. This was consistent with the specific way Freddie had organized the relationship between his private world and his professional one across the years of his illness. Garden Lodge was its own territory, managed by its own rules, and the people inside it were the people he had chosen for the private life rather than the public one. At some point during the gathering, in the specific moment that Peter Freestone has returned to across 30 years of interviews and memoir passages and carefully worded answers to carefully worded questions, Freddie Mercury said something to the people in the room. The precise words, as Freestone has reported them in various forms, amount to this: that today was his birthday, and he wanted people to be happy, and he did not want anyone to cry. The instruction was not dramatic. It was not delivered with the theatricality that a lesser storyteller might have applied to it. It was said in the specific, direct, slightly impatient way that Freddie Mercury said things when he was communicating something that mattered to him and did not want the communication to become an occasion for emotional management. He meant it, and the people in the room, who understood exactly what he meant and exactly why he was saying it, found the not crying to be one of the more demanding things they had been asked to do. The food and wine that Freddie Mercury had asked for were present on the table. Peter Freestone has described the meal with the kind of specificity that suggests it was one of the things he fixed his attention on. That day, the practical, tangible, manageable reality of food and plates and glasses, which gave the hands and the eyes something to do in the intervals between the larger thing that everyone in the room was also doing. Freddie ate. Not with the appetite of his earlier years, the illness had long since altered his relationship with food, but with the specific deliberateness of someone who had decided that today he was going to eat at his birthday table and was going to do it properly. He drank champagne. He had asked for it specifically. There was a cake, though the details of it have been less precisely documented than the champagne. The afternoon had the rhythm of a birthday afternoon: the arrival of the food, the opening of bottles, the accumulation of small pleasures that mark an occasion as distinct from an ordinary day. What the people in that room were feeling beneath the surface of the ordinary birthday afternoon is something that each of them has described in their own way and at their own distance from the event. Jim Hutton has written about that period in terms of a sustained and private grief that he managed by focusing on the immediate, the next hour, the next task, the specific needs of the specific day. Peter Freestone has described a quality of attention that he brought to everything about Freddie during that final period, a heightened awareness of detail, a noticing of small things, the specific behavior of someone who understands they are in the presence of something that will not be available for much longer, and who is therefore paying more attention than they would otherwise know how to justify. The birthday gathering concentrated this quality of attention into a single afternoon. Everyone there knew what 80 days or fewer looked like on the horizon. Everyone there had agreed, in Freddie's presence and at his specific request, to be happy. The most revealing thing about Freddie Mercury's behavior on his 45th birthday is not the instruction not to cry, though that instruction is the most direct and most memorable thing he said that day. It is the broader pattern of behavior of which that instruction was a part. The decision to have the birthday, the decision to make it as ordinary as possible, The decision to ask for specific food and specific wine and specific people. The decision to be present and engaged for the duration. All of this was consistent with the pattern that had defined Freddie's management of his illness from the beginning, the sustained, deliberate prioritization of other people's experience over his own difficulty. He had been doing this since 1987. Every recording session he attended when attendance was costly. Every public appearance he maintained after it had become an act of will. Every phone call to his mother in which his voice gave nothing away. The birthday was the same pattern in its most intimate and most domestic form. A man managing the experience of the people he loved by insisting that today, on his birthday, the experience would be good. Peter Freestone published his memoir of Freddie Mercury in 2001, a decade after that birthday. A decade into the 30 years of protective silence that this story is named for. The book describes the final period with care and with genuine emotional honesty, and it contains passages about the birthday that approach what happened that day without quite reaching the center of it. Freestone has been asked about the 5th of September 1991 in interviews across the subsequent years, and his answers have a consistent quality. Warm, specific in some details and general in others, always turning at a certain point towards something that does not quite get said. This is not evasion. It is the behavior of someone for whom the full weight of that day has not diminished with the passage of time, for whom the instruction not to cry has retained, across 30 years, its specific and located power. He has described it. He has not described all of it. The difference between those two things is the space this story lives in. The 80 days between the 5th of September and the 24th of November 1991 are the final chapter of a story that had been running for 4 years. They contain the completion of the last recordings, the final vocal takes, the last sessions at Mountain Studios. They contain the gradual further withdrawal from everything outside Garden Lodge. They contain the specific and documented moments of those final weeks that the people present have described across the years, the conversations, the silences, the particular quality of light in the house in late autumn. The birthday sits at the opening of that final chapter as a specific and deliberate act. A man choosing to mark the beginning of his 45th year with the people he loved, in the house he had built his private life inside, doing the ordinary things that ordinary people do on their birthdays, because the ordinary things were what he wanted, and because wanting them and having them, even in diminished form, was a form of living that he was not willing to give up until he had to. Brian May and Roger Taylor were not at the birthday. Their absence is not a failure of care. The specific arrangements of Freddie's final months reflected his own decisions about who he wanted present in the Garden Lodge world and who he wanted to encounter in a different register. Brian May has spoken about the period of September through November 1991 with the quality of a man who was close enough to know what was happening and far enough away to have experienced it at a remove that he has never entirely reconciled himself to. Roger Taylor, similarly. Both have described the final months in terms that suggest a sustained and difficult negotiation between their desire to be present and their understanding that presence had specific meanings in that context that not all of them were equipped to provide. The birthday was Garden Lodge's day. The band was elsewhere, carrying their own version of the same 80 days. The objects of the birthday, the flowers, the card, the champagne glasses remained at Garden Lodge in the way that the objects of a life remain after the person who chose them. Mary Austin, who inherited the house and spent the following 30 years as its keeper, has described Garden Lodge as a space that carries Freddie's presence in the specific way that lived-in spaces carry the people who were most fully themselves inside them. The birthday objects were part of that presence, small, datable markers of the last time that occasion was observed, kept by the person who had promised to keep everything. What Peter Freestone kept secret for 30 years was not a scandal and not a revelation. What he kept was the specific quality of that afternoon, the texture of it, the weight of the instruction not to cry, the way Freddie Mercury moved through his last birthday with the combination of frailty and intention that had characterized everything he did in that final period. He kept it because it belonged to the people who were there, And because the full weight of a thing said in a room between people who love each other does not survive translation into public property without losing what made it matter. Freddie Mercury turned 45 on the 5th of September, 1991. He asked the people he loved to be happy. They tried. He knew they were trying. That was enough.